Hi, everybody. Welcome to Resistance Live. It's ECM. It's Friday, the 28th of March, 2025. I'm exhausted. This has been a hell of a week. I know everybody else feels the same way. But we have to talk about a very recent development as of this morning. Donald Trump has gone to the Supreme Court, and it is on the Alien Enemies Act. And we have to talk about this and the implications of it. But we have a lot more to discuss today. There's just, like, as seems to be the case, a flood of news this Friday, and we're so far from done. So first things first, today for our visually challenged viewers, I'm wearing a cream colored t-shirt with a chocolate colored, I finally managed to do that right with this sweater, chocolate colored sweater over top. My hair is down. I'm a pink skinned, green eyed, dirty blonde haired woman. And I'm coming to you as always from occupied Tongva, not Tongva. That's my old place in California, occupied Muncie, Lenape, and Mohegan land. Okay, so this morning, Trump's DOJ, through the Solicitor General, has filed an emergency appeal to the Supreme Court on their claim that they can deport anyone they want without due process using the Alien Enemies Act. This is after the D.C. Circuit late yesterday refused to stay the order. And while this is not surprising, it does raise a kind of interesting administrative moment, which is that the Chief Justice in charge of cases coming from the D.C. Circuit is Chief Justice John Roberts. And one of the things that the Trump administration does in this brief is it berates all these courts that have been issuing EOs against the administration. Well, you all will remember that earlier this week, actually, it might have been last week, it all blurs together, Chief Justice John Roberts did an unprecedented thing and issued a public statement saying that there should not be any attempt to impeach judges who are ruling against the Trump administration, and that attacks on the judiciary have to stop. So maybe not the best legal strategy to argue about how you hate all the courts that are ruling against you when the person who's going to be reviewing it as an initial matter is Chief Justice Roberts. But we'll see how this goes. They have asked for an administrative stay. Now, those of you who have been here for a very long time know that an administrative stay is ordinarily a temporary stay that is entered while the Supreme Court decides to consider whether to take a case. However, this is a very unusual circumstance. Ordinarily, I would be sitting here telling you all, don't get freaked out if they grant an administrative stay, right? Because it's just like the usual thing that happens, and it doesn't mean they've lost for good and all that other kind of stuff. I am not convinced that's going to go down in this situation because the stakes are so high. Chief Justice Roberts knows, as do, like the other folks who are leaning more against the Trump administration right now. Let's just remember that he lost this week 7-2. The folks who are leaning against him, I think, understand that any break in the stay is going to potentially result in the removal of people who were here legally to concentration camps without any due process. So again, we're going to have to see exactly how this plays out. But, it is not, not the wisest legal strategy to approach this in the way that they did. And I also want people to understand that there's no guarantee the Supreme Court is going to take it. If they don't take it, the stay stands, entirely possible. And if they do take it, they don't have to grant the administrative stay. So again, novel approach. I will remind everybody, this is not the way these things normally go because this is a TRO, not a permanent injunction. Ordinarily, in the process of appellate procedure, you would wait until the trial court was done and had granted a permanent injunction before you tried to appeal it up the chain. But again, rules don't matter to this administration, so they're trying it anyway. And we will have to see what happens with this. It may, I would expect, given that it's an emergency appeal, we'll know something about this by the early next week, if not before. So keep your eyes peeled on that, because the other thing that I'm just watching from a tea leaf reading perspective right now is what's happening on the Supreme Court vis-a-vis these truly outside the boundaries of any sense of law or constitutionality actions that the Supreme Court is taking. And my bet is that we have kind of a strange situation happening here with Justice Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett, who has now consistently joined, not consistently, let's say this, more than occasionally joined the liberal justices in voting against some of Trump's initiatives. So, there may be a 5-4 majority against the Trump administration developing in some of these matters, and we'll have to wait and see. Okay. We had another development out of the same court in the DC District Court yesterday. Judge Boasberg, as you will remember, has the Alien Enemies Act case. And he is the judge who has been very, very, very angry about what has happened in relation to the flouting of his orders. Well, as you know, if you were here earlier in the week, he has now been assigned a second case. He got the Signal Gate case yesterday. And so there was a 4 o'clock hearing yesterday. As you all will remember, we talked about this on yesterday's broadcast. And in that hearing, he granted another temporary restraining order, this one requiring everybody who was on that Signal chat to preserve the communications that were contained on it. Okay, now, one of the problems with this is that Michael Waltz and potentially others had messages set to disappear in Signal, which is something you can do. I have it set in my Signal to do that. My messages disappear within 24 hours in most of my chats. This is not an unusual thing, but obviously there are claims that they have flouted the Records Act. And so the preservation of those materials is very important, not just for purposes of evidence, but also so they comply with the law. Now, what has happened in the interim since Jeffrey Goldberg left that chat is kind of anybody's guess. But nonetheless, at this point, if they violate that order and delete those materials now that they are supposed to be preserved, then there's another basis for Judge Boasberg to hold people in contempt. So again, major developments happening up and down the chain of the law right now. And we're still waiting, by the way, on the order to show cause that Judge Boasberg was litigating overseeing in the Alien Enemies Act case, which concerns the potential for contempt for flouting his order. So I have been waiting for that since Tuesday, as have most legal observers, and we'll have to wait and see exactly when that comes out. But I have a feeling it's not going to be terribly pleasant. Okay, so Elise Stefanik has learned the hard way yesterday really. But here's something kind of interesting. I think everybody here knows that there are 2 special elections coming up next week in Florida to fill seats that were vacated by people who are now serving in the Trump administration or abandoned it because they didn't want to have to disclose all the teenagers that they had paid for sex in the case of Matt Gaetz. So those 2 elections are coming up next week. And there is some new polling that is really, really interesting out of those 2 districts in Florida. So many of you know that these are 2 very gerrymandered red districts, okay? One of them went by 44 points to Donald Trump in the 2024 election. However, the polling yesterday shows, and this is kind of a bit of a bellwether. The polling yesterday from YouGov shows that right now, the Democratic challenger to one of those seats is only down by 4 points. By 4 points. So we have kind of like and that's, by the way, like close to the margin of error. So we're now in this situation where there's a little bit of a danger that if 3 seats were to flip in the House, the Republicans would lose it. And those 2 seats in Florida, it's anybody's guess. I would be shocked if Matt Gaetz's seat flips blue, but you never know. It sounds like we're kind of close. That could result in a narrowing or a complete overturning of the control of the House. So what happened yesterday? Well, Elise Stefanik is the 3rd person with an allegedly open seat of upstate New York. And she was the UN ambassador, and there were plans to hold a special in her district. Yesterday, Trump withdrew her nomination to the United Nations because he was concerned about the Republicans losing the House. He did not consult with Stefanik before he did it. Apparently, when it started to circulate that might happen, she desperately pleaded for him not to pull her name, and he didn't listen. And she has lost, after having sold her soul to Donald Trump, she's now lost her plum job. She's lost her leadership position in the Republican Party in the House, which she cannot get back. And she's now essentially a sitting duck because a named candidate was polling very well against her, who now may challenge her in 2026 and win. So Stefanik got screwed. I can't say I feel terribly bad about that because she has been such a sycophant that she made her bed. But I will say, again, I have to tell you guys, they know they've got weakness. They know that what they're doing is not polling well. They know from the town halls and the various polls that are being conducted right now that people are wildly opposed to cuts to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and SNAP. They know that 70% of the country is polling as being essentially outraged by what happened in the Signal chat with Mike Waltz and Marco Rubio and others, and Pete Hegseth disclosing classified information about military operations. They know they're in hot water. And the thing I have to say to all of you about this is, like, we have to keep the pressure up. We have to keep the pressure up because they fold sometimes on really scary stuff when the pressure is put on. So speaking of really scary stuff, there was a news report this morning that Doge and Elon Musk are essentially going to try to rebuild the entire Social Security database. I'm not convinced that this is actually going to happen. My sense is that this is like a trial balloon that, once again, they're floating to see what happens. But it raises the possibility that all of Social Security could crash. Because as you will recall, we talked about this months ago now, the Social Security databases contain parts of code that has not been rewritten since like the 80s. And the guys who are rewriting all this stuff don't know how to code for that. So there is deep concern about this. And again, like, I don't want anybody to panic in this audience. And at the same time, it's another reason to make your voices heard. Like, call your representative and your senators and tell them that you don't want Doge rebuilding the Social Security database, that it terrifies you that they're going to do that. Okay. It's like, it's really important to make your voice heard on that as well. Okay. Last night, there was a horrific white supremacist executive order entered concerning like culture and the truth of American history. And what it seeks to do instead is to defund parts of the Smithsonian that the Trump administration deems as too woke, quote unquote. That includes, by the way, potentially fucking with, pardon my French, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And I'm just going to tell you, if you have not watched what has happened on Blue Sky since this EO was signed in Black Sky, you should be paying attention to it, because there is absolute outrage at the prospect of defunding the National Museum of African American History and Culture. It is a place in Washington, D.C. that Black folks visit when they come to visit DC on purpose. Whole trips are planned around it. And the idea that they will essentially defund what is the United States center of documentation of Black history in this country is outrageous. Add on top of that the fact that this EO plans to decimate all funding to the planned Women's History Museum. So, you know, I know we all know this, and I'm preaching to the choir here in this audience, okay? But essentially what they're attempting to do with this EO is ensconce white supremacy as the only history of America. And we've seen the plans for this play out in other ways, right? Again, I have to remind you all, an EO is not law, okay? It's not law. They haven't defunded anything yet. They're making recommendations, okay? And EOs can be challenged in court. What they essentially are is instructions to agencies within the executive branch. It's not like this is a done deal. And at the same time, it is one of the clearest signals that we have had so far about the ideology that we all know, not all of America, but I think everybody in this audience knows, is running the current administration. So this is, again, something where you can and should make your voice heard. If you believe we deserve a Women's History Museum in this country, you should mention that to your electeds. If you are outraged, as I am, at the potential destruction of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, you should include that in the calls that you make, right? Because truthful history teaches us lessons that we desperately need to learn from right now, okay? Really critical to understand exactly where this is coming from and why. Speaking of which, I have a bone to pick this morning. I'm going to try not to go all in the way that I have at some instances, but many of you know, as I spoke about earlier on this week, and I've mentioned several times on Blue Sky and also in this morning's Fridays in Trumpland on my Substack, Jason Stanley and Timothy Snyder have both left Yale to go to the University of Toronto. And there are people both on the Patreon feed this morning and on my Blue Sky who have claimed that it is wildly outrageous that they have opted to leave. And I have to tell you that that kind of thing makes me really upset, in part because Jason Stanley's family has a very significant history of anti-fascism that I think everybody should be aware of. Okay, so I'm just going to tell you what it is because I feel like nobody really knows the deal here. Plus, Jason Stanley is raising two children of color who are young. and has very serious concerns about the tilt of America toward fascism. So in case you didn't know this, Jason Stanley has a really rich family history. His grandmother was a woman, German Jew, who between 1936 and 1938 undertook what, in my opinion, was perhaps the most courageous attempt to liberate Jewish people directly from concentration camps that I have ever read about, particularly working with an SS officer and several other very brave souls. She obtained orders that were drafted by this SS officer who was sympathetic to what was happening to walk herself as a German Jew into concentration camps with an order for the release of particular people. And she did it in full deception, with understanding that none of it would ever be written down, that only one person that was trusted knew where she was. And she would walk in, she would hand over the order. If she was asked for any backup, the only thing she could do is share the name of the SS officer who had endorsed this. And she would demand the release of the Jewish individual who was being held at that concentration camp. She did this successfully 412 times. 412 lives she saved. And then in 1939, right before Hitler shut down the ability of Jewish people to leave Germany, she fled with her husband and her 2 young children to America. She is Jason Stanley's grandmother. So here's where I come at this from, all right? And I want to make it really clear. Timothy Snyder and Jason Stanley are the nation's foremost experts on authoritarianism and fascism. Jason Stanley in particular has a very deep family history of understanding about what happens when nations fall to fascism. And there are people running around today who are like, they're leaders. They have an obligation to stay and fight. I'm sorry. I got something I got to say about this. And I really want people to hear this, okay? You can't fight back when you're dead. You can't fight back when you're dead. And academics are being targeted right now. Literally yesterday, a Harvard researcher was snatched by ICE because she's spoken out against Vladimir Putin. She's been disappeared to that same Louisiana facility where Mahmoud Khalil is being held. And she's probably going to be deported to Russia, where she will likely be killed. You cannot fight back when you're dead. And I personally think that this thing of like everybody has an obligation to stay and fight is a demand for people to sacrifice their lives for the work that you yourself are not willing to do. Because they're private citizens like everybody else, and they're also leaders. And for them to be able to have the opportunity to leave the country for an environment where they're going to be able to speak freely, where in Jason's case, he's going to be able to raise his 2 children of color in an environment where they will not be under the same kinds of threats, and where they will have the opportunity to continue the good work of being cultural critics and academics in favor of democracy, I think is excellent. Like, I'm just going to give it a full-throated endorsement. I have no problem with them leaving the country. And I know that there are people out there who are, I don't know, perhaps envious of the ability of 2 academics to leave the country and get a job elsewhere. And I understand that there is a great degree of privilege that comes from the capacity to even leave. And simultaneously, I think people need to really have a very clear-headed moment about where we are and what we're facing down and what leadership looks like. Somebody this morning on Blue Sky, and I had to block this guy in the end, was like, but Navalny went back to Russia. Navalny's dead, okay? Was a hero to everyone. His legacy lives on. His wife is an icon, but he's dead. He was the biggest challenge to Putin, and he's dead. So, again, it's one of those things where you have to really understand that resistance has to operate on multiple fronts. And if you want leaders who are going to lead and inform and educate about where we really are, if you want experts who are currently under threat to be able to survive this moment and continue, you cannot slam people for leaving the country when they're given the opportunity to do so, because that's going to actually allow their leadership to go on. Okay? I really want people to get very, very, very clear about this. I find it so difficult. Everybody's got to make their own choices. And also, I just have to say this. I think there is a lack of understanding right now of the degree of threat that those of us who are speaking out publicly are actually under. Because if the Trump administration can sweep up someone who has just written, a student who's written an op-ed about Palestine, a Harvard researcher who has spoken out against Putin, and disappear them into concentration camps, they can do that to any one of us at any time. It just simply is a matter of them deciding that they want to do it. Because unless and until due process is reestablished, none of us are even going to have a chance to fight it. So fundamentally, the people who are saying they shouldn't leave, they should stay and fight, are saying you should die for this. You should be willing to die for this, to orphan your children, to widow your spouse. And I think it's a huge degree of hubris to demand that people do that when they have an opportunity to carry on alive and fighting. Okay, so that's what I have to say about that. And I think people, frankly, should stop this nonsense of they shouldn't have left the country. I feel very, very strongly about it. You know, and I know we're going to have other people leaving. I'm going to remind you, Zerlina Maxwell, former MSNBC reporter, you know, incredibly brilliant person. I had the opportunity to meet her several years ago. She's a genius. She left for Italy last fall. She's gone. You know, people who have the opportunity to do this and feel a need to do it have done it. Rosie O'Donnell, who I also worked with on a mass mobilization in 2019, has moved to Ireland because she has a 12-year-old non-binary child who she's afraid will be harmed given her public profile and how Trump has come after her. Okay. These are legitimate safety concerns that people have about their own families. Okay. And if you would not have demanded that Jewish people stay in Nazi-occupied territory during the Nazi regime, you should not be demanding that people stay here and die for America. Full stop. I mean, everybody's got to make their own decisions and their own ability, but I am really bothered by this, particularly bothered by it in light of Jason Stanley's family history, because he knows what we're up against. Like, he probably knows better than most. So that's my 2 cents about that. All right. This morning, Trump threatened again to attack Denmark, claiming that Greenland is necessary for national and international security. The Greenland folks are so outraged about Donald Trump right now that literally nobody has agreed to meet with anybody from the U.S. delegation that's going there now. And it's been reduced to J.D. Vance landing at a very remote military base for like an hour or two before coming home. What they are trying to do is really like gin up a desensitization of the idea of us attacking a NATO ally. And I want to make it really clear, like, if we attack Denmark, all bets are off. They are a NATO ally. That will turn NATO against the United States. It could potentially be like a Franz Ferdinand predictor moment for another world war. And again, you know I've heard reports, gotten emails in the last 24 hours from people who have been at Republican town halls where Republican representatives have laughed at the prospect of us invading Denmark. Donald Trump doesn't seem to think it's funny. So again, I want to just remind everyone that there is a key importance right now of making your voice heard on this and all the other issues that we've talked about today, because he's off his rocker, but also like really playing with fire. And he needs to be shut down on this as a prospect and a lot of other things. Okay. It is a weekend of action. Tomorrow is the global mobilization for Tesla takedown. I have a huge plea here today that I just want to mention. I kind of relates to something that I talked about in a couple of training calls for the organizers that we're training right now, and that I think I mentioned here earlier on in the week, which is this. Okay. This is really a moment for white folks to step up. And I want to make it really clear that there's a number of reasons for doing that. But at this moment, you know, there's folks even on the Patreon feed who have never done a protest who are getting out there this weekend. And I want to really encourage you to do that at this time. The Latino community is terrified. Okay. U.S. citizens who are Latino are being detained by ICE and interrogated and stopped in their everyday lives and asked to produce proof that they're U.S. citizens. Black and brown folks have been at the forefront of protest movements in this country for generations. The Tesla takedown protests are safe. There have been hundreds of them. There's only 2 incidents that I'm aware of where there's been any kind of violence threatened, or actually that's taken place. Very limited. They're also really fun. You know, this is the other thing that I just want people to kind of like be aware of. The Tesla takedown protests are like joyful. Like there's music and dancing and signs and bells and whistles and all sorts of other things. And everybody that I know who has done one so far has really like made new friends and come away with a sense of hope and an understanding that this movement is really important as a pushback against oligarchy and against Elon Musk's incursion into the government. And so, you know, one of the things that I just have to caution here is that I know there are people who are very concerned about safety, but it's also really important to have a clear-headed understanding of where your privilege puts you on the risk list, right? And understand that, you know, if you're a white person who doesn't have like a huge public profile and is somebody who is just like showing up with a sign to protest for a few hours on a Saturday, the chances of you being persecuted are like close to 0 right now. May not be that way forever, but that's where it is right now. And so I really want to demand that those of you who have not attended something like this before, step out of your comfort zones and try. And I think what you're going to find is that it's a good time for a good cause, and we need more of it. And they are like literally something like 6 dealerships away from covering 100% of the Tesla dealerships in the country with picketing and protests tomorrow. And that's not even including what's happening overseas. So I want people to understand that like there's a dire need for people to step up right now who haven't done this sort of thing before and can do it in relative safety. Because one thing that we've talked about here many times over the last 8 years is that white folks putting their bodies on the line for things like this, when the risk is much greater for other folks, is a sign of solidarity and also much more likely to move the needle. Okay. So if you can make it to a Tesla takedown protest this weekend, if there's a Tesla dealership near you and you're not in far proximity from it, and you have the ability to do it without putting yourself like at dire risk, right? That's for the immune compromised and disabled people, the people for whom leaving the house is really, really dangerous. I really want to encourage you to try to do it. Okay. Because this movement in particular has already done so much damage to Musk that has potentially threatened his capacity to stay on in the government. And if you missed the interview that he did a couple of nights ago, he's not in good shape anyhow, right? Like, I don't think anybody could have watched any of that footage and thought that man has it all together by a long shot. Not that that's been a question, but like, he doesn't look well. And one of the things that we have to remember here is that the more wealth he loses and the more Tesla stock falls, and yes, there's been a little rebound this week, just sit tight on that. There's some questions about why, that raising my old securities fraud eyebrows a little bit. But the closer he gets to having those loans that he took out to buy Twitter come due, and that could potentially be like the end of his involvement in the US government. So the pressure is really critical right now. And I want to thank all of you who have shown up before. I want to thank everybody who's planning on showing up tomorrow. I want to express my gratitude to those of you who are doing this like with clear observation of safety protocols. I was asked this morning on the feed, by the way, what had changed about my views about protesting in the last couple of months. And so let me just say this. My concerns have always been about the safety of individuals. Right now, Tesla takedown is organized with like extremely clear safety protocols. They've got observers in the crowd. They've got legal observers. They've got safety protocols for every protest. They have trained people in how to do this. The same, by the way, is true for Indivisible and Move On and their mobilization coming up on April 5th. They've got an entire safety and security briefing coming up on April 2nd. So the thing now is about the balance, right? Because at this moment in time, these protests are actually like not against Trump, which is also a really interesting feature to them. They are in a way a sort of like side swipe at what's happening, and a really critical one. All right. So Trump can't claim that this is like insurrection, right? Tesla's not the federal government. So it's a different framework from, you know, what we might have anticipated in advance of the inauguration. And for that, I'm very grateful, right? I think it's a real opportunity for people to make their voices heard. And I also just want to say this. I have to shout out all the people who are doing like the hard work locally where they live of caregiving. And what I mean by that is like working with migrant support organizations, working with organizations that support abortion rights and LGBTQ folks, that are doing the work of protecting trans kids, that are out there doing the work of climate protection and food security, because there are so many unsung, unrecognized heroes that are keeping people afloat right now. And I just want you to know, if that's you, because we got a lot of them in this community, like I see you, and your work is just as important. There's a lot of ways right now to get involved, and it's really critical that everybody do something, right? Just do something. And that can be volunteering with a local organization, building out a community pod, starting a community garden, donating food or money to organizations that need it. And it can also be showing up at a Tesla takedown protest or with Indivisible and Move On and making your voice heard. But all of it matters, because things are crumbling on one side of the fence. And the work that all the rest of us are doing over here is what's actually going to help to keep people alive. So, yeah, I think that's it for now. You guys are awesome. I'm so grateful for this audience. If you like what we're doing here, please don't forget to drop me a comment. If you're watching on the replay, it tells the algorithm that you like us. Don't forget a thumbs up and a subscribe. You can hit that bell notification. We also are going to have some free training videos coming up on this site, on our channel, I think starting next week, that are going to relate to some topics that come up very routinely here, like how you should deal with your Trumpy family members. And if you have them, I'm sorry. Or for instance, how to deal with the overwhelm of the current moment. I'll also remind you, we have this amazing free guide available right now. I will drop it into the comments afterwards, but it's also in the show notes, called How to Move from Overwhelmed to Impactful in These Current Times. So if you're feeling overwhelmed and flooded, scared, panicked, please pick up the free guide. It's like long. It's a huge PDF. It's really beautiful. Thanks to my staff for pulling it together. But that also will be a supportive resource for you. And, just remember that, the way that we get through this is in community. So the more that you can build local community where you live, in addition to being a part of our community here, the more likely it is that we're going to get through this. Okay. And be able to push back in ways that challenge what's happening. Because remember this, like, nobody knows the future. Nobody knows how this is going to go down. Nobody knows what could change things in an instant. Nobody knows what's going to be like the thing that puts the chip in the wall, right? So keep doing all the good work, all right? I will see all of you back here on Monday at regular time. For our Patreon subscribers, there will be a Progressive Coffee Hour on Sunday. And I hope you all have a restful weekend. All right, my friends, I will see you back here real soon. All right, take care. Bye.